Millionaire's Christmas Eve redemption, saving a little girl and her grandmother in a blizzard. In a blinding Christmas Eve blizzard, the life of Edward Cross, a powerful millionaire who had long buried himself in work, took an unexpected turn. Alone in the luxurious Evergreen Grand Hotel, he was startled to see a fragile child struggling through the storm, her desperate plea piercing through the icy darkness. "Gran, I have to find Gran." What began as a simple act of rescue became a harrowing journey that tested not only his endurance, but also his heart. Would he risk everything to reunite this brave little girl with the only family she had left? And could this act of compassion help Edward reclaim the love he'd lost with his own estranged son? But before we dive deeper into this heartfelt tale, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Wishing all my viewers a Merry Christmas, filled with joy and family. If you love this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more stories like this. The Evergreen Grand Hotel stood like a sentinel against the darkening Christmas Eve sky, its Victorian architecture a stark silhouette against the swirling snow. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light through vast windows, their warmth seeming to mock the bitter cold outside. The hotel's grandeur, evident in its marble floors, ornate crown molding, and rich mahogany paneling, felt hollow tonight, its opulence dampened by an overwhelming sense of solitude. In the cavernous lobby, a massive Christmas tree reached toward the vaulted ceiling, its thousands of white lights twinkling in perfect programmed sequence. Designer ornaments in silver and gold caught the light, creating an expensive yet sterile holiday display. The usual bustle of guests had dwindled to nothing as the storm intensified, leaving only the whisper of the heating system and the muffled howl of wind against thick window panes. Footsteps echoed across the marble floor, sharp, purposeful steps that belonged to Edward Cross. His reflection glided across the polished surface. Tall, distinguished, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 52, his dark hair had begun graying at the temples, lending him an air of authority that served him well in the boardroom. His face, handsome but severe, bore the careful neutrality of someone who had spent decades mastering their emotions. Edward made his way to the hotel bar, empty save for the bartender, who straightened immediately upon seeing him. "The usual, Mr. Cross?" the young man asked, already reaching for the top-shelf brandy. Edward gave a curt nod, settling into his usual leather chair by the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across his features as he gazed into the amber liquid, a nightly ritual he'd perfected over years of solitary Christmas Eves. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow fell in thick curtains, obscuring the meticulously landscaped grounds. The wind picked up speed, howling through the valley like a hungry beast. Tree branches swayed and creaked under the weight of accumulating snow, their shadows creating ghostly patterns on the pristine white drifts below. The weather service had warned of record-breaking snowfall, but Edward had dismissed their concerns. The Evergreen Grand, perched high in the mountains, had weathered countless storms before. The darkness beyond the windows deepened to an impenetrable black, broken only by the hotel's exterior lights reflecting off the swirling snow. The effect was disorienting, a white maelstrom against infinite darkness. The storm's ferocity seemed to amplify the silence within, creating a bubble of artificial calm that felt increasingly fragile as the night wore on. It was the kind of night when anything could happen, when the barrier between the ordinary and the extraordinary grew thin. Though Edward Cross, taking another sip of his brandy, would have scoffed at such fanciful notions. He had no way of knowing that this Christmas Eve would be different from all the others, that somewhere out in that swirling darkness, fate was preparing to shatter his carefully constructed solitude. The brandy burned pleasantly as Edward swirled it in his glass, the amber liquid catching the firelight. His phone sat face down on the side table. He'd stopped checking it years ago on Christmas Eve. The last message from Alex still lived somewhere in his text history. Don't bother calling anymore. I'm done. 5 years. 5 years since he'd heard his son's voice, save for the professional voice message he'd encountered last week during a moment of weakness. The memory of their final argument rose unbidden in his mind, sharp and clear as broken glass. You missed my graduation, Dad. My graduation. Alex had stood in Edward's office doorway, his cap and gown still on, face flushed with anger and hurt. The Morgan merger was more important? Really? You don't understand the responsibilities I have, Edward had replied, not looking up from his computer screen. This deal means security for both of us. Your trust fund. I don't want your money. The words had exploded from Alex like they'd been building for years. I wanted my father at my graduation. I wanted you at my games, my science fairs, my birthday dinners, but you were always here, in this office, chasing the next big deal. Edward had finally looked up then, but it was too late. He'd seen something break in Alex's eyes, something he didn't know how to fix. His son had turned and walked away, leaving Edward alone with his empire of spreadsheets and contracts. Other memories flickered through his mind like an accusatory slideshow. Alex's 10th birthday, when Edward had sent his assistant with an expensive gaming console but couldn't make it himself. The school play where his empty seat in the front row had stood out like a wound. The parent-teacher conferences he'd repeatedly rescheduled until they didn't bother asking anymore. Each memory carried the weight of a choice made. Business over connection. Edward took another sip of brandy, longer this time. He'd told himself it was all for Alex's future, that each missed moment was an investment in his son's security. Now, sitting alone in a luxury hotel on Christmas Eve, that justification rang hollow. The truth was, work had been easier than fatherhood. Spreadsheets didn't need emotional connection. Contracts didn't require vulnerability. Mergers and acquisitions followed clean, logical rules that Edward understood far better than the messy, complicated business of being a father. A movement caught his eye through the frost-etched window, something small and dark against the whirling snow. Edward leaned forward, squinting through the glass. The hotel's exterior lights carved a dim sphere of visibility from the storm, and within it, a figure stumbled through the deepening drifts. A child's figure. Edward's chest tightened. The small shape wavered, nearly falling, then righted itself to press forward against the wind. No coat. He could see that even from here. Just what looked like a sweater, already heavy with snow. The child, a girl, he thought, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Good God, he muttered, rising from his chair. The bartender looked up questioningly, but Edward was already striding toward the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows. The girl had stopped moving, swaying slightly as she hugged herself against the cold. She seemed to be looking toward the hotel, but the glare from the lights would make it impossible for her to see inside. Edward's hand moved toward his phone, intending to call hotel security, but something made him hesitate. How long would it take them to mobilize, to get properly equipped for the storm? He glanced at the heavy wool coat hanging by the door, then back at the small figure in the snow. The girl took another stumbling step, and this time didn't quite recover, dropping to one knee. His practiced logic warred with an unfamiliar urgency. It wasn't his responsibility. He could call security or the police. Let professionals handle it. That would be the sensible thing to do. The safe thing. The Edward Cross thing. The girl tried to stand and couldn't. "Damn it," Edward growled, already shrugging into his coat. The bartender called something after him, but Edward didn't stop. He grabbed a blanket from one of the lobby's oversized chairs and strode toward the entrance, his shoes, Italian leather, certainly not made for this, clicking against the marble floor. He partly took. As the doorman reached to open the heavy glass door, a gust of bitter wind and snow burst into the lobby. Edward squared his shoulders against it, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. The girl's dark shape had become almost indistinct in the thickening storm. But she was there, and she was alone, and for the first time in years, Edward Cross was about to step outside his carefully ordered world. The wind hit him full force as he left the shelter of the doorway. Snow stung his face, instantly coating his eyelashes and making it difficult to see. His leather shoes sank deep into the drift, snow spilling over the tops and soaking his socks. The cold was immediate and vicious, cutting through his wool coat as if it were tissue paper. If it was this brutal for him, how was a child surviving it? Edward pushed forward, each step a battle against the wind and deepening snow. The hotel lights created a disorienting globe of swirling white, making distance difficult to judge. He'd thought the girl was perhaps 30 yards away, but the distance seemed to stretch impossibly as he struggled forward. The wind howled in his ears, drowning out everything else. His feet were already numb. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the storm. The dark shape ahead hadn't moved. "Can you hear me?" Another 10 yards. His breathing came in sharp bursts, the air so cold it hurt his lungs. The wind changed direction, sending a blast of snow directly into his face. Edward turned sideways, squinting against the onslaught. When he could see again, his heart stopped. The girl was no longer standing. He pushed harder, abandoning any pretense of dignity as he half ran, half stumbled through the snow. She lay crumpled in a drift, half buried already by the falling snow. Up close, she looked even smaller, her sweater pitifully inadequate against the storm. Dark hair whipped across her face in the wind. Edward dropped to his knees beside her, ignoring the biting cold that soaked through his trousers. He brushed the snow from her face with trembling fingers. Her skin was pale as paper, lips tinged with blue, but he could see small puffs of breath in the freezing air. "Can you hear me?" He wrapped the blanket around her thin shoulders, pulling her into a sitting position. "What's your name? Where are your parents?" The girl's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of startling blue. She looked at Edward without really seeing him, her gaze unfocused. "Gran?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Have to find Gran." "You're safe now," Edward said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "I'm going to get you inside." He started to lift her, but her small hands suddenly gripped his coat with surprising strength. "Please," she managed, those blue eyes now focusing intently on his face. "Gran's out here, somewhere. Have to." Her voice trailed off as her eyes closed again, her grip on his coat loosening. Edward felt a spike of fear he hadn't experienced in years. Without further hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, blanket and all, cradling her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, like lifting a bundle of twigs wrapped in wool. The journey back to the hotel seemed twice as long, each step a battle against the wind that threatened to knock him off balance. Edward hunched over Sophie's small form, trying to shield her from the worst of the storm. Her face pressed against his coat, pale and still. Only the slight movement of her chest assured him she was breathing. His arms burned with the effort of carrying her. Though she was light, the wind's resistance made every step a challenge. Snow had soaked through his pants to his skin, and his feet were blocks of ice in his ruined shoes. But he barely noticed. All his focus was on getting her to safety, on the increasingly urgent need to warm her up. Twice he nearly fell, his feet slipping on ice hidden beneath the snow. Each time he recovered, tightening his grip on Sophie's limp form, his heart pounding with the knowledge that a fall could be disastrous. The hotel's lights seemed to recede rather than draw closer, playing tricks with his perception through the curtain of white. Finally, impossibly, his shoulder hit the glass door. The doorman, who'd been anxiously watching their approach, sprang into action, pulling it open. Warm air rushed out, the sudden temperature change almost painful against Edward's frozen face. "Mr. Cross," the doorman's eyes widened at the sight of Sophie. "Should I call an ambulance?" "Blankets," Edward ordered, his voice rough from the cold. "And Dr. Morrison, he's staying in 412. Get him down here now." He strode into the lobby, leaving wet footprints on the marble floor. "Clear that sofa by the fire, and bring hot water bottles. Move!" The lobby erupted into controlled chaos. The bartender vaulted over his counter, racing to help. The night manager appeared, phone already in hand. Edward ignored them all, focusing on laying Sophie gently on the sofa nearest the fireplace. Her sweater was soaked through, her dark hair crusted with ice. "Someone get me dry clothes," he barked, his usual corporate authority now tinged with something rawer. "Children's clothes. Check the gift shop if you have to. And where the hell are those blankets?" The staff scattered to comply, their usual professional decorum replaced by urgent purpose. Edward knelt beside Sophie, checking her pulse the way he remembered from a long-ago first aid course. It was there, thread-like but steady. "I've reached Dr. Morrison," the night manager reported, hurrying over. "He's on his way down. Should we call the police about—" "Not yet," Edward cut him off, accepting a stack of warm blankets from a breathless housekeeper. "She mentioned her grandmother's out there somewhere. We need to—" He broke off as Sophie stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. "No," she said. "I don't want to end up like them." "Get some sleep, Hope." "Gran," she whispered again, so faintly he had to lean close to hear. "Please." "We'll find her," Edward promised, surprised by the fierce certainty in his voice. He looked up at the gathered staff, his expression brooking no argument. "I need search parties organized. Every available person. The grandmother can't have gone far in this weather." The night manager nodded, already turning away to coordinate the effort. Edward turned back to Sophie, tucking the blankets around her small form with unexpected tenderness. Something had shifted in him out there in the storm, some long-dormant protective instinct awakening. For the first time in years, spreadsheets and profit margins felt utterly meaningless. Dr. Morrison arrived as the staff was helping Edward remove Sophie's wet sweater, replacing it with a dry hotel robe that engulfed her small frame. The doctor, a silver-haired man who'd clearly been roused from sleep, took in the scene with practiced efficiency. "How long was she out there?" he asked, kneeling beside the sofa and opening his medical bag. "I don't know," Edward admitted, stepping back to give the doctor room but unable to move too far away. 10 minutes since I found her, but before that—" He trailed off, watching as Dr. Morrison checked Sophie's vital signs. "Who is she?" The fireplace crackled behind them, its heat slowly beginning to bring color back to Sophie's cheeks. Hotel staff moved quietly but purposefully, bringing hot water bottles wrapped in towels to tuck around her, adding more blankets, preparing hot tea that sat steaming on a nearby table. The lobby's Christmas tree continued its programmed light show, casting shifting patterns across Sophie's pale face. "Her body temperature is low, but not dangerously so," Dr. Morrison announced after several tense minutes. "You got to her in time, Mr. Cross. She needs warmth and rest, but I don't think she'll suffer any lasting effects." Edward released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He sank into a chair beside the sofa, his own wet clothes forgotten as he watched Sophie's breathing become deeper, more regular. Someone, the bartender, he thought, pressed a glass of brandy into his hand, but he set it aside untasted. In the warm light of the lobby, Edward began to really look at the child he'd rescued. She couldn't have been more than 8, with a delicate face that reminded him of a porcelain doll his mother had once collected. Her dark hair, now drying in the fire's heat, curled slightly at the ends. Long eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, and her small hands, resting atop the blankets, occasionally twitched as if reaching for something, or someone. A tag peeked out from the collar of her sweater, now draped near the fire to dry. Edward leaned forward to read it. "Property of Sophie Williams," written in careful block letters, the kind of label a loving parent would sew into a child's clothes. The simple detail hit him with unexpected force. Sophie. She had a name, a story, a grandmother out there somewhere in the storm. She wasn't just some anonymous child he'd saved. She was someone's whole world. He noticed other details now, the small scuff marks on her shoes, suggesting a child who liked to run and play, a friendship bracelet woven in bright colors around her thin wrist, the way her face, even in sleep, held a trace of determination that spoke of a strong spirit. Each detail made her more real, more precious, and simultaneously more fragile. A memory surfaced. Alex, at that age, falling asleep on the couch in Edward's home office while waiting for his father to finish work. Edward had always called his assistant to carry Alex to bed. When had he stopped seeing his son's vulnerability as something beautiful and started seeing it as an inconvenience? The night manager approached quietly, breaking into Edward's reverie. "Sir, the search parties are ready. We've divided the grounds into sectors and—" "Good," Edward cut in softly, not taking his eyes off Sophie. "But I want police and professional rescue teams too. Cost is no object, and have the kitchen send up soup and hot chocolate. She'll need something warm when she wakes up." He paused, then added, "The good hot chocolate from the chef's private stock." The manager nodded and withdrew, leaving Edward to his vigil. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but its howl seemed less threatening now, muted by the warmth of the lobby and the steady rhythm of Sophie's breathing. Edward settled deeper into his chair, ignoring his own discomfort from his wet clothes. He had made a promise to find her grandmother, and Edward Cross kept his promises. At least, he used to, before spreadsheets and shareholders became his whole world. Sophie stirred beneath the blankets, her fingers curling against the soft fabric. Edward leaned forward, watchful. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened fully, revealing those striking blue eyes again, this time clear and alert. She blinked at the Christmas tree lights, then turned her head toward Edward. "You found me?" she said softly, her voice scratchy but steady. "In the snow." Edward stood abruptly, motioning the manager away from Sophie's hearing. In the shadow of a massive stone pillar, he kept his voice low but intense. "What complications?" "The police are stretched thin. Multiple accidents on the highway. They can't spare many officers. And the professional rescue teams," the manager shifted uncomfortably. "The storm's too severe for helicopter searches, and they're saying the ground teams will take hours to mobilize." "Hours?" Edward's voice rose before he caught himself. "There's an elderly woman out there, alone in this storm. Hours could mean—" He stopped, glancing back at Sophie, who was watching them with worried eyes over her hot chocolate mug. Edward nodded, suddenly unsure what to say. Board meetings and corporate negotiations hadn't prepared him for conversations with 8-year-old girls. How do you feel?" he managed. "Warm." The question startled a chuckle from Edward. "Just a hotel," the evergreen cranned. "I'm Edward Cross." He paused, then added gently, "Can you tell me what you were doing out there in the storm?" Sophie's face fell, her previous wonder replaced by worry. "Gran and I were walking to church for the Christmas Eve service. We always go. Every year since—" She swallowed hard. "Since Mama went to heaven. But the snow got worse, and Gran started coughing, and then I couldn't see her anymore." Tears welled in her eyes. "I tried to find her, Mr. Cross. I looked everywhere, but everything was white, and I got so cold." "You're safe now," Edward assured her, surprising himself by reaching out to pat her hand. "We have people looking for your grandmother, the best people." He reached for the hot chocolate that had been placed nearby. "Here, drink this. It will help." Sophie wrapped her small hands around the mug, inhaling the rich chocolate scent. "Mama loved hot chocolate," she said after taking a careful sip. "She used to say it was like drinking a hug. Gran makes it for me now on special days, or when I miss Mama too much." "What happened to your mother?" Edward asked softly, recognizing the familiar shadow of loss in her young eyes. "Car crash 2 years ago, right before Christmas." Sophie spoke matter-of-factly with the direct honesty of children discussing painful things. Gran says Mama's an angel now, watching over us. That's why we never miss church, especially on Christmas Eve. Gran says it makes us closer to her. He took another sip of hot chocolate, then continued. It was just me and Mama before. Then Gran came to live with us when Mama got sick from working too many jobs. After Mama went to heaven, Gran sold her house in Florida to stay with me. She says we take care of each other now. Sophie looked up at Edward, her eyes bright with tears and trust. You'll find her, won't you, Mr. Cross? Gran's all I have left. The raw hope in her voice struck Edward like a physical blow. He thought of Alex, of all the times his son had looked at him with similar trust before learning not to expect too much. Sophie had already lost her mother. She couldn't lose her grandmother too. Not on Christmas Eve. Not while Edward Cross had the power to help. The night manager's return shattered the moment. Mr. Cross, I'm afraid we've hit some complications with the search, said the director. Sir, I understand, but... No, you don't understand. Edward stepped closer, his frustration crackling like static electricity. I want every available staff member out there. Maintenance, housekeeping, kitchen staff. Everyone. Double overtime pay. Triple. I don't care about the cost. Most of our staff live in town, sir. They've gone home for Christmas Eve. The roads are nearly impassable now. We're operating on minimal. Then get them back. Send cars for them. Send the damn hotel shuttle. The shuttle's already stuck in the parking lot. The snow's too deep. Edward ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he thought he'd trained himself out of years ago. The familiar sense of control was slipping away, replaced by a helplessness he hadn't felt since Alex walked out of his office that final time. He turned away from the manager, pacing the marble floor. How many times had he promised Alex that anything could be solved with enough money and influence? That power meant never having to accept no for an answer. Now, with the child's grandmother lost in the storm, all his wealth and connections meant nothing against nature's implacable force. The Christmas tree lights reflected off the lobby's windows, turning them into mirrors. Edward caught sight of his reflection, expensive suit still damp from the snow, his carefully maintained composure cracking. Behind him, he could see Sophie watching, her small face a study in barely contained fear. She trusted him to make this right, just as Alex had once trusted him to be there for his graduation. The parallel hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd failed his son through choice, through putting his own priorities first. Edward turned back to the night manager, his voice deadly quiet. Get me the chief of police on the phone, and the mayor. I don't care if you have to wake them up. Tell them Edward Cross is calling in every favor he's owed. And find me somebody who knows these mountains. Locals, ski instructors, anyone who might know where a lost woman would seek shelter in this storm. Terry pursed her lips. The manager nodded and hurried away. Edward returned to Sophie's side, forcing a reassuring smile. We'll find her, he promised again. And this time, the words felt like a covenant. He couldn't undo his failures with Alex, but he could make sure this little girl didn't lose anyone else she loved. Not tonight. Not on his watch. Mr. Cross? Sophie's voice was small but steady. She'd finished her hot chocolate, leaving a slight smudge above her lip. Would you like to see a picture of my mama? Edward settled back into his chair as Sophie reached for her sweater, now mostly dry by the fire. From a pocket, she carefully extracted a worn photograph, its edges softly frayed. She handled it with the reverence usually reserved for precious gems. This was at the beach, she explained, holding it out to Edward. Our last vacation together. Gran took the picture. Edward accepted the photo carefully. A young woman with Sophie's dark hair beamed at the camera, her arm around a smaller version of Sophie. They wore matching sundresses, their faces glowing with happiness. The ocean sparkled behind them, a perfect summer day frozen in time. Mama worked at the hospital, Sophie continued, her fingers tracing patterns on the blanket. She was a nurse. She worked lots of extra shifts so we could go on that trip. Gran said Mama worked too hard, but Mama said making memories was important. Sophie's voice wavered slightly. She was coming home from a night shift when the accident happened. It was icy, like tonight. Edward's throat tightened. He looked at the photograph again, seeing details he'd missed. The slight shadows under the mother's eyes, the proud set of her shoulders, a single parent doing everything she could for her child. Gran saved everything, Sophie said. All Mama's pictures, her nurse badges, even her favorite coffee mug. She tells me stories about when Mama was little, so I won't forget. And she always makes sure I have homework done and eat vegetables, just like Mama wanted. A tear slid down Sophie's cheek. But she also lets me be sad sometimes, when I really miss Mama. She says it's okay to be sad as long as we remember the happy things too. Sophie reached for the photo but didn't take it back, instead touching her mother's face gently. We were supposed to go to Florida this Christmas, to Gran's old house. But Gran said we should stay here instead, keep our traditions. She said, Sophie's voice caught. She said Mama's spirit is stronger here where she lived. That's why we had to go to church tonight. Gran promised we'd never miss Christmas Eve service, no matter what. Edward listened, mesmerized by the wisdom in Sophie's words, the depth of love between these 3 generations of women. He thought of his own son, of all the traditions they'd never established because he'd been too busy building his empire. How many school plays and baseball games had he missed? How many chances to create memories had he dismissed as inefficient uses of time? His phone sat heavy in his pocket, Alex's number still programmed in despite 5 years of silence. How many Christmas Eves had his son spent wondering if this would be the year his father finally called? How many times had Alex looked at old photographs, trying to remember happier days? Your grandmother sounds like an amazing woman, Edward said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes. She is. After Mama died, some people wanted me to go live with a foster family. They said Gran was too old to take care of a kid. But Gran fought for me. She said, family stays together, no matter what. Sophie looked up at Edward, her blue eyes intense. She never gave up on me, Mr. Cross. So I can't give up on her. We have to find her. The simple declaration hit Edward with the force of revelation. His son's words from their last fight echoed in his mind. You gave up on us, Dad. On me. He justified it as being practical, focusing on what he could control, work, money, success. But sitting here with Sophie, her mother's photograph between them, he understood the magnitude of what he'd lost. Some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing everything to protect. Love, family, the trust in a child's eyes. The night manager returned, his expression grim. Mr. Cross, I've reached the police chief. They're doing what they can, but with the accidents on the highway. He glanced at Sophie, then lowered his voice. In these temperatures, in this time, their best bet is on the coast to arrange a fishing party. Edward stood abruptly, moving away from Sophie's hearing. His mind raced through options, calculations, probabilities, the way he'd analyze a business problem. But this wasn't business. This was life and death, written in the worried creases around Sophie's eyes. The church, he said suddenly. How far is it? St. Michael's, about 2 miles down the mountain. But sir, you can't be thinking. His curiosity. Get me proper winter gear, boots, heavy coat, whatever we have in the gift shop or lost and found. Edward's voice held the tone that had closed billion-dollar deals. And I need a map of the area, detailed as possible. The manager's face paled. Mr. Cross, the liability alone, if anything happened to you. I didn't ask about liability. Edward turned back toward Sophie, who was watching them intently. I asked for gear. Mr. Cross? Sophie's voice was small but clear. Are you going to look for Gran? Edward returned to her side, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Sophie, I need you to tell me exactly what happened when you got separated, every detail you can remember." "Sophie," Edward repeated his words carefully. "We were walking on the path from the church parking lot," she said, sitting up straighter. "Gran started coughing. She has a bad cough sometimes. She stopped to rest against a tree. Then the wind got really strong and there was so much snow." Her voice wavered. "I reached for her hand, but she wasn't there anymore." "The tree, what kind was it? Did you notice anything special about it?" Sophie's face scrunched in concentration. "It was really big, and there was a statue near it, an angel. Gran always says hello to it when we walk past." She nodded with pride for her family and hoped her expression was real. "The guardian angel monument," the manager interjected. "It marks the old church path through the woods." Edward nodded, pieces falling into place. He looked at Sophie, seeing the hope building in her eyes. The logical part of his brain screamed that this was madness. He could get lost himself, freeze to death in the endless white. The storm showed no signs of weakening. Every business instinct told him to wait for professionals, to manage risk, to stay safe. But Sophie was looking at him the way Alex used to, before disappointment taught him better, with complete trust, with faith that adults, that fathers, did the right thing no matter how hard. "I'll find her, Sophie," Edward said, the words coming naturally now. "I promise." "I know you will." Sophie reached for his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. "Because you're brave. You came out in the storm for me, even though you didn't know me. And," she hesitated, then added softly, "Gran says love makes people brave." Edward squeezed her hand gently, feeling something crack and heal inside his chest. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, telling himself that emotional distance was strength. But here was this child, who'd lost so much, teaching him about real courage. The hotel's SUV handled better than Edward's luxury sedan would have, but that wasn't saying much in these conditions. Snow had drifted across the mountain road in white waves, making it impossible to tell where the pavement ended and the shoulder began. The headlights caught the whirling flakes in their beam, creating a hypnotic tunnel effect that forced Edward to grip the wheel tighter, fighting the urge to fixate on the swirling patterns. He'd insisted on driving himself, despite the manager's protests. The borrowed winter coat and boots felt strange, like costume pieces in a play where he'd been miscast as the hero. The map lay on the passenger seat, though it was nearly useless now. He could barely see 20 feet ahead through the storm. The SUV's tires lost traction on a curve, beginning a slow slide toward the guardrail. Edward's hands moved instinctively, turning into the skid the way his father had taught him decades ago. The vehicle fishtailed, then straightened, but not before his heart had lodged somewhere in his throat. The guardrail had looked frighteningly insubstantial in his headlights, winter-rotted wood offering little protection from the steep drop beyond. "You're out of your mind, Cross," he muttered, easing his foot off the gas as another gust of wind rocked the SUV. What did he think he was doing? He wasn't some action hero. He was a businessman who hadn't driven in snow for years, who hired people to handle anything physically demanding or dangerous. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. Christmas Eve was almost over. Somewhere out in this storm was an elderly woman who'd fought to keep her granddaughter, who'd given up her home in sunny Florida to preserve what remained of her daughter's memory, who went to church every Christmas Eve because tradition and love mattered more than comfort or convenience. Another sharp curve loomed ahead. Edward navigated it with agonizing slowness, his knuckles white on the wheel. A memory surfaced. Alex at 16, asking for driving lessons. Edward had hired an instructor instead, too busy with a corporate takeover to spare the time. "It's more efficient this way," he told his son. "You'll learn from a professional." The hurt in Alex's eyes had been swift, quickly masked. One more small rejection in a lifetime of them. One more moment when Edward had chosen efficiency over connection, professional success over personal involvement. The SUV's back end slipped again and Edward fought for control. His pulse pounded in his ears as the vehicle straightened once more. Was this redemption he was seeking? Or penance? When had he become the kind of man who needed a child's crisis to teach him about courage and commitment? He thought of Sophie's face as he'd left, trying to be brave despite her fear. "Please find her," she'd whispered, pressing her mother's photograph into his hand, "so she can see I kept it safe." Such a small gesture, such enormous trust. Through the swirling snow, Edward caught a glimpse of something pale and tall, the angel statue Sophie had mentioned. He turned the SUV carefully onto what he hoped was the old church path. The vehicle's heavy tires crunched through deepening snow as branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers. Alex used to trust him that way, once. Used to believe his father could solve any problem, fix any crisis. When had Edward stopped trying to be that person? When had he decided that emotional distance was an acceptable trade for professional success? The SUV's headlights caught a dark shape ahead, a massive oak tree near the path. Edward's pulse quickened. This had to be where Sophie last saw her grandmother. He eased the vehicle to a stop, its engine idling in the howling wind. The clock read 11:54 p.m. "I'm trying to be better," he whispered. Though whether he was talking to Sophie, Alex, or himself, he wasn't sure. Then he zipped the coat up to his chin, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he swept the flashlight beam in wide arcs around the oak tree. Nothing but undisturbed snow. He was about to return to the SUV when a faint orange glow caught his eye through the trees. Firelight, wavering in the storm. Edward hesitated. He'd seen news reports about homeless encampments in the area, had even signed petitions to have them removed from near his office building downtown. But something drew him toward the light. If anyone knew these woods, it would be people who lived in them. He found them in a small clearing, huddled around a fire that somehow stayed lit despite the wind. A makeshift shelter of tarps and branches protected them from the worst of the storm. 3 men and 2 women looked up as his flashlight beam cut through the darkness. But even at arm's length, the glow cast a shadow across the metal flooring. "Well, well," one of the men said, rising slowly. He was older, with a weathered face and sharp eyes. "Don't usually see suits out here on Christmas Eve." He said. He turned to one of the silent women. Edward lowered the flashlight, suddenly aware of how he must appear despite the borrowed winter gear. "I'm looking for someone. An elderly woman, lost in the storm. Her granddaughter? The little girl with the blue sweater?" One of the women spoke up. "And her gran with the bad cough?" Edward's heart leaped. "You've seen them." The group exchanged looks. The older man nodded slowly. "Woman passed by maybe 2 hours ago. Offered her shelter, but she was determined to get to church. Started coughing something awful, though. Mike took her to the old ranger cabin. Couldn't let her stay out in this," another man, presumably Mike, added. "She was worried about her granddaughter, but could barely walk. The cabin's got a wood stove, some emergency supplies," were whispered with a grand expression that revealed thousands of battles. "Where?" Edward's voice cracked with urgency. "Please, her granddaughter's safe at the hotel, but—" "Funny how things work," the older man said, studying Edward's face. "Rich folks like you spend most of the year pretending we don't exist. But here you are on Christmas Eve, needing our help." He smiled slightly. "Cabin's about 1/4 mile east, following the old fence line. Can't miss it. Only building still standing in these woods." "Thank you," Edward said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. He reached for his wallet, but the old man waved him off. "Keep your money. Just remember this feeling next time you see someone needing help. Nobody's too important to be kind." He glanced at the others. "Mike, show him the path. Storm's getting worse." The younger man nodded, grabbing a flashlight. As they turned to leave, Edward heard the old man add quietly, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Cross." Edward stopped, startled. "How did you— Your picture's in the paper often enough, man who owns half the city." The old man's eyes crinkled. "Now go find that girl's grandmother. Some things matter more than owning buildings."